Hello, hey, good evening, everyone. We'll be getting started in just a moment as everyone begins to enter the room. Also wanted to just give everyone a heads up that we record these sessions for future use, and they are available down the road on the westdale.ca. So just wanted to let everyone know that this is recorded. All right, good evening and hello everyone, and welcome to the Westdale Theatre Presents Film Noir. This is part 4 of a 5-series talk led by Mr. Fred Fuchs, chair of the Westdale and Hollywood film producer and former president of American Zoetrope Pictures. Before Fred begins his talk on Detour, I just wanted to take a brief moment to introduce myself. I'm Jeff Bender, volunteer with the Westdale Cinema, and wanted to share some brief notes before we begin. During Fred's talk, and I'm seeing a lot of familiar names in the participant window, so this is probably old hat for many of you, but just for any of you that are new to the talk, during Fred's talk, if you have questions or thoughts about the film, please use the Q&A option, which is located at the bottom of your screen. And at the end, what we'll do is we'll try to get to as many of your questions and comments on the film as we're able to. And if I happen to see some similar ideas, I may combine them in the interest of time. Also, a quick word, of course, the Westdale Theatre, beautiful cinema in Hamilton. It's a historical designation, built and opened in 1935. And of course, what's been wonderful through these challenging times is how the Westdale team have come together to bring a variety of different types of programming to you in the midst of, this pandemic situation. And so I just wanted to mention that if you're interested in finding out more about past programs that exist, please go to the website. And of course, you can provide a charitable donation at the donate section within the webpage. So without further ado, I want to pass it over to you, Mr. Fuchs, and we'll catch up with all of you and your questions in just about half an hour.
So welcome, everybody, and I hope you enjoyed the film. I'll be curious to find out how many of you might have seen it in the past, or if this was for your first time. This is a film that did pass into public domain. Nobody really cared a whole lot about it, in the 60s, 70s. It was kind of, just a B movie and never really got much acclaim. But it certainly became sort of a favorite. And little weird 16mm prints would float around. In fact, I first saw it in a bar in Connecticut in probably 1973. And it was obviously not a great print, but made a deep impression on me at the time. And I hope some of you might have had a chance to see this restored version, which was done in, I believe it was 2018, fairly recently, that Criteria Collection did. And it's really, watching it this week was a completely different experience than I had had in the past. And in fact, the restoration was actually funded by the George Lucas Foundation. And I know that this was one of George's favorite movies. And if you think about some of his early work, you might know why. It's very interesting, of course, that over the years, this film did get quite a bit of recognition. In fact, in 1992, when there was the first, they formed a national film registry at the Library of Congress in the US. This was selected as being culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. And, very interesting for a film that was made for $118,000, had 68 minutes, had no sets, was a B movie with no stars. But what this represented was, of course, a whole genre of these kinds of B movies that were made by these poverty row studios, as they called them at the time. And there must have been, hundreds made. And in fact, often actors and directors would be in 5 or 6 movies a year. Of course, because in those days, when you went to the cinema, you got a whole program. You saw a cartoon, you saw a newsreel, you saw a B movie, you saw an A movie. So there was a lot of demand for films. And the solution was to make them very inexpensively like this, And of course, what is so extraordinary is what actually happened in this film. And that was primarily, of course, to the director, Edgar Ulmer, who we'll talk about a little later. I love the way it was sold. He was looking for love, but fate caused a detour. Very, very Hollywood kind of pitch. But of course, fate is really what this movie is about. The other thing, of course, you should remember, and fate, being a theme that we're going to talk about, is that this was made in the final days of World War II. And this whole concept, of course, about fate seems kind of deeply pertinent. And I would think, would be something that these guys coming back from Europe or the Pacific who survived while many of their friends were dead, and all the civilians who were being killed in, Poland and China and, all over, I don't know, is it a comforting thought to believe that, it's fate that really makes these decisions for us? And maybe that there's some kind of explanation as to why I might have survived and someone else did. Again, our lead character, Al, he can't explain why he feels why should he be cursed, I mean, when he meets Haskell, and why does Haskell overdose? And, why did Vera happen to be Haskell's last passenger? And why did Vera happen to be at the gas station when he arrives? And why were there no witnesses to Haskell's death, So, this really is the story of a man who's sort of dogged by fate, right? And he, he's hearing it, he sees it everywhere. In fact, even to the very end of the film, and fate appears as the patrol car. But we'll talk about the ending and how that came about later, because that was not in the original script. But, this really is sort of the story of a man's attempt to escape his destiny or to delay it, And it really feels to me like that's the reason that, Tom Neal's performance as Al works, because most of the time he's kind of this very weak and kind of washed out kind of guy. And of course, the director was quite brilliant in terms of leaving the camera on his face, and let the emotions just play. But, he sort of, his voiceover, he's really just sort of whining about, his life and how all these unfortunate things happen to him. And he's kind of clueless, right, about everything, and he doesn't want to, talk to Haskell. He doesn't want to do any of this. And he tries to, be silent. But, with Vera, of course, he's, completely on his back foot all the time. And when he does speak, he, sort of begging for something. And Vera, of course, is not, bounced around by fate. She's clearly has a will and a will of what she wants. And that gives her tremendous momentum against, this other character, Al, who's sort of just drifting through things and seems to be kind of accepting fate as it comes. But again, this is this world of film noir. And by the way, remember, when this film was made, there was no such thing as film noir. In fact, the term wasn't even first mentioned until several years later with some French critics. But no one thought they were making a film noir movie, the way today people will make something inspired by film noir. They were just making B movies and making movies that they thought, were at least, in this case, where we had this unusual director, were interesting in themselves. But most of them were really done as just sort of fodder to sort of fill the screens, and that was it. And even at 68 minutes, this film is padded, for time, right? All these shots of telephone exchanges and the music numbers. If you really take out all the padding, it's probably, a 60-minute movie or something, But nevertheless, as much as this is, sort of patched together cinematography and some of the weird, bad gangster dialogue, it's a really engrossing movie, an interesting movie. And mostly, of course, because it's so dark. And of course, how does this come out of this period that was the Hollywood's golden age? Al tells us, pretty early on, the world is full of skeptics, and I know I'm one myself, right? So of course we start at the end, right, when he's in Reno, and everything's happened. And he, of course, he's telling us all of this in, these improbable flashbacks, and things seem to get worse and worse. But this is typical of film noir voiceovers, right? But the most creative aspect to me of Detour is the fact that we have this unreliable narrator, that maybe Al is lying about this story. Why is such a crummy guy coming across as so noble? Do we really believe that someone as chaste and lovely as Sue, is associated with this guy, right? And then after, no companionship for months, he decides not to have sex with Vera, who's throwing herself at him. And these two people who are dying randomly, so this unreliable narrator, he never acknowledges he's lying, but there's something very interesting about how he presents himself. And he talks sort of directly to us, right? We don't really believe what's happening, but Al really is trying very hard to get us to believe it. He calls it a spurious but flattering account. As he describes things. And then, of course, sometimes he has these moments of, almost fantasy about Sue, being in Los Angeles and being successful. And none of this is necessarily real at all. And his cover up of Haskell's death is some kind of, rationalization. So there's a lot of kind of traumatic activity going on, but I think part of why this film is so creative and exciting is this bizarre narration and something we're always hearing, but trying to make pieces out of it. Now, the production of the film was very strange. There are sort of two basic ways sometimes people make films. And Alfred Hitchcock, of course, is the example of, the film's completely in the creator's head. And, he would storyboard meticulously everything. And then he would just go out and shoot exactly what he wanted. And then the second, style is really more that one that thrives on the process, where, you're constantly making and changes and inventing things during the process of filmmaking. And one of the best examples of that, of course, is Francis Coppola. And if you think about Apocalypse Now or many of his movies, a lot of them really were informed by the process itself, and the script would change every day, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no question that Detour is this kind of process type, right? In many ways, the story is almost incoherent, and until kind of the end. And some of the design is very strange, where we strip away the characters and and we change viewpoints. In fact, in the original novel, there was actually a second voiceover that was from Sue. And in fact, that was in the final shooting script, so this changed drastically as they went to shoot it, And again, the very ending of the movie and how we ultimately just become totally locked into Al's disturbed consciousness really developed later, on the set or even during the editing. There was a novel, actually. It was written by Martin Goldsmith in 1939, and he did the adaptation of the book for the film. The book was quite different. It was, Al was a much darker and more of a evil guy and an enemy. But when Ulmer got involved, he realized there was a chance to do something perhaps a little unusual. And one of the things, of course, he did was he cast no stars, right? Although Tom Neal and Ann Savage had been in a few movies, B movies, and in fact, in a few B movies together, audiences didn't really know them. So without that kind of pre-knowledge of the characters, then the audience really is just open to what they're seeing on the screen. And the director could make them as cruel and kind of dismissive as he want, because they didn't have any obvious love for these actors or really even knew these actors, So again, to me, part of why this is so mesmerizing, even beyond any of the more famous film noirs, that there's no relief here. There's no light. There's no sense of humanity. Even Sue is like a distant dream. I'm not even sure what she's doing in this story. She doesn't seem to fit in at all. Now, there have been a lot of rumors about the production. Often it's been said it was shot in 6 days, which actually is not true. It was actually shot in 28 days, and much of it was done in the desert in Lancaster, California. And also the rumors were it only cost $20,000, but it really was, I think the final budget was about $118,000, which is still obviously a very small amount of money. I think the director got paid $7,500 for directing this. So, this, this character Vera, of course, is one of the great femme fatales of film noir. As soon as she appears, and she doesn't appear until almost 32 minutes into the movie, almost half the movie goes by before she even shows up, which is kind of extraordinary when she's the second lead. But once she shows up, she is just this, nonstop force. And some of her lines, stop making noises like a husband, or when she threatens to send him to the gas chamber, sniffing that perfume Arizona hands out free to murderers. What a lovely woman, And even at the end, even, with her death, she, he's the sucker, right? Because he's going to get blamed for having murdered her. Right. So it's just crazy. In fact, it's interesting. The original novel said, God or fate or some mysterious force can put the finger on you or on me for no good reason at all. But of course, in the film version, they took out the word God. But there's an implication, I think, that, what is this fate? What is this mysterious force, So again, the novel was quite different, lots of changes. In the novel, we have a whole series of Sue chapters about what happens to her in Hollywood and the challenges she gets into. But all of that, eventually disappeared, and the director completely focused this on Al, and this slippery kind of disturbing shape of the film, which I think is so remarkable, and the tone of the film, as I said, really came much more into the process. And of course, the final scene is really interesting because that wasn't in the script either, but it actually came from the production code report. So as you know, there was a production code. They had to read every script before they're allowed to be shot. And in their notes, it said, it's absolutely essential that the end of this story, Alex or Al, be in the hands of the police and possibly have been picked up by a highway police car as he was hitchhiking. So, we had this concluding moment and narration of Al's voice, but again, is this really happened? Is this just something he's, telling us because he thinks it's going to happen? We don't really have a solid sense of what's going to happen. What's the law going to do with him even when they do pick him up? And how are they going to connect all these things together? So that fabulous last scene, at least to me, fabulous last scene, was not something anybody really conceived of except at the express requirement of the production code. So it's always interesting how these films evolve and how great things can come out of and great notes can come from strange places. So again, you look at what crime films and a noir film, again, they didn't know they were making a noir film, but in crime films, mostly bad guys know they're bad. And noir films often, someone thinks he's a good guy who's just been ambushed by life, or, in some way, as Al says, whichever way you turn, fate sticks out a foot to trip you. And many of the noir heroes, of course, are defeated through their own weaknesses. Even if you think of Bogart last week in A Lonely Place. But I don't know any characters who are weaker than, Al Roberts. This guy is just whining away with self-pity and pleading his case in his voiceover that somehow life has not given him a fair break, right? So, this movie is full of all sorts of technical errors, all sorts of strange, wipes and the way we move from scene to scene. Sometimes, they actually had to flip the negative for the hitchhiking scenes. I don't know if you noticed, but, they're trying to show, a guy from New York City traveling west to Los Angeles, right? So that would be sort of a right to left flow across the screen in terms of film, and film craft. But in order to accomplish that, since they didn't shoot it, they had to flip the negative. So you might have noticed that sometimes they're driving on the wrong side of the road. And the steering wheel, was actually as if they were in England, and the hitchhiker is getting into the car on the driver's side. Again, just the kind of stuff that they did because they had no time, no money. They had to just get through the film. And we'll be showing you some images later that were also, created for, practical reasons of just trying to make the movie work. In fact, the car itself that's owned by, Charlie Haskell and driven by Al, very memorable prop. They had so little money, they actually had to use the director's car. This was Edgar Ulmer's personal car. And it's a customized 1941 Lincoln Continental V12, and in a very limited production in 1942, very expensive car, very unusual car. And of course, it became a great character in this film. So, of course, none of this is all, in my opinion at least, attributed to the director Edgar Ulmer. So Ulmer is a very unusual character in the history of Hollywood. He was German. He grew up and worked in the early days with Max Reinhardt's theater. I think you've heard me mention that before, which was where a lot of people got their apprentices. He worked with all of the great German directors. His real mentor was F.W. Murnau, who made many great silent movies in Germany, and of course later came on to do Sunrise and other films in Hollywood. Billy Wilder, Fred Zinnemann, Robert Siodmark were all working at the time. Ulmer worked on films like The Golem and Metropolis and M. And he did come with Murnau in 1926, and he was sort of, an assistant art director. He kind of did all sorts of jobs working with these mentors, and many of them, of course, went on to become quite famous. Fritz Lang, for example. But Murnau's life never evolved, and his career never evolved in a typical way. He actually made a brilliant movie in 1930, a silent film called People on Sunday, which is still considered, one of the great films from the German Expressionist period. And then in 1934, he did start to get to direct, and he did a movie called The Black Cat, which is an absolutely wonderful atmospheric thriller, not really a film noir, but something worth seeing. And that was with Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff. But unfortunately, he started to have an affair with a woman named Shirley Kassler, who happened to be married to the nephew of the head of Universal Studio, Carl Laemmle. And, Kassler got divorced. He did wind up marrying Shirley, and she became, his script supervisor, worked with him on screenplays, was really quite an important person in his managed to sort of blacklist Ulmer from working in Hollywood. And he had almost no choice but to go look elsewhere to making films. And he started to make what they called, and this is around the late 30s, early 40s, what they called ethnic films. And he actually shot a film in Yiddish. He shot a couple of films in Ukrainian. There's an ethnic film he did called Green Fields that is a Yiddish film. And there was a place for these films in the theatrical world. And they did make some money, and he made some unusual films, but they were certainly nothing close to, Hollywood or what Hollywood was. And it was only when he came back in sort of, I guess, the mid 40s that he could find work, and it was only the work he could find was doing these B movies. And his career really never managed to be much more than that, even though he certainly was as brilliant as any of these guys. And again, as a teenager, was really considered, a savant, and everyone thought was going to be one of the great filmmakers, of all time. And you can see moments of that absolute brilliance. And one is, for example, after he accidentally strangles Vera with a telephone cord, and he comes into the bedroom and you think about, you know, the way the camera takes his point of view and looks from object to object and moving in and out of focus. And I mean, this is a remarkable reaction to a killing in the movie. You know, he doesn't pack up and run away. You know, he's like, you know, I just think these are the kind of directorial touches that are quite incredible. So, you know, very personal film, I think, very you know, of his cinema style, the German expressionism, you know, the motel nightmares, you know, that he has, his fixation on fate and doom. You know, these are all very subjective storyline. These are all examples of sort of these expressionistic flourishes, right? It's funny. There was a famous interview he did with Peter Bogdanovich, and he told her, "I really am not looking absolution for all the things I had to do for money's sake." You know. So once again, here are two great characters, though, and that's what makes this film. And classics, right? The submissive man, and you know, the female hellion. You know. Now Tom Neal, of course, who plays Al Roberts. Very strange character. Was born to a very wealthy family. He was an amateur boxer. In 1943, he made seven movies, including this one with several movies with Ann Savage. Never became a star. Always lived in this world, the B movies. You know, I haven't really seen a lot of his work, so it's hard for me to talk about him as an actor. I think in this movie he's fantastic. His kind of, you know, flaccid, passive, self-pitying, you know, character is perfect for this material. And actually, he was unlucky in real life too. He was convicted of manslaughter in the death of his third wife, but that's another story. And then, of course, Ann Savage, you know, is just extraordinary to me in this film. There's not a single fleeting shred of tenderness or humanity in her performance as Vera, you know. And somehow she could say that pulp dialogue, you know, what'd you do, kiss him with a wrench? And it seems to play, you know, instead of laughing, you know, it feels like great dialogue and a great character. And, you know, and you know, and Tom, of course, is always playing back to him. You know, oh, my favorite sport is being kept prisoner, and just every single line. You know, she's calling him a sucker and a sap, and you know, he can't escape from her. He locks her. You know, she has the key to the room, and you know, and even though she gets completely drunk, you know, he can't seem to get away from her. You know, it does feel like he's sort of wallowing in this mistreatment, and you know, and somehow, again, fate or deserves it. I'm not really sure. You know, Ann Savage's Wim Wenders, the great German filmmaker, called her performance as Vera 30 years ahead of its time. You know, there was no kind of pretense to it. It was so real and just original and memorable, and you know, and it's just an incredible performance. Or else maybe that's who this actress was. She only was 24 years old, by the way, at the time of shooting this. Is this, you know, angry, oversexed femme fatale. You know, when we first meet her, you know, she's described, she looked like she had just been thrown off the crummiest freight train in the world. And she's just sort of dozing along, and then suddenly, oh my God, she's attacking him. Where'd you leave his body? Why'd you leave the owner of the car? Your name's not Haskell. And when Al comes to the realization he's been picked up by the dame with the claws, which is so beautifully foreshadowed in the earlier scene with Haskell, when Haskell shows him, you know, the claws. But anyhow, again, she was in more than 20 B movies between 1943 and 1946. And then she actually made a very memorable reappearance in a film by a Canadian director named Guy Madden. She plays the mother in My Winnipeg. I don't know if any of you've seen this movie, but it's absolutely a wonderful movie. And I think she was nominated for some awards from this movie. And suddenly a whole new legion of fans discovered Ann Savage. And Guy Madden obviously must have been a huge fan of this film to go out and find her, because she was not working at that time pretty much at all, you know. And you know, again, for someone like Savage, she dismisses most of her roles as mindless. And the actors were just scenery, particularly the actresses, and you know, the male actors, and the dialogue was ridiculous. But she knew that this movie was really something different. And of course, it's a role reversal, right? That you know, that the woman is the one blackmailing the man, and you know, is the vicious, predatory, sexually aggressive one. Well, usually, you know, most of the films of the period, that was the man, and the woman was the victim. And supposedly they didn't get along during screening, during the filming at all. And in fact, Savage says that, you know, Neal embarrassed her on the set by putting his tongue in her ear, and she retaliated by slapping his face as hard as she could. And they didn't even speak to each other except with, you know, filming scenes. And you know, what a fun, crazy movie this must have been to make. And in fact, in that early scene when we see Ed Savage trying to hitchhike, a passing car actually stopped to try to pick her up because they couldn't even tell a movie was being shot. Again, such a low budget movie that, you know, I don't know if you remember the early, the sweater that she wears in the beginning. That was actually the, you know, the director's wife, Shirley Ulmer's sweater. And it had to be pinned, you know, with you know, and in certain places you could actually see clothespins, you know. I never had seen them until this restored version, but you know, this is the kind of low budget movie it was. And as Peter Bogdanovich maintains, nobody's ever made good pictures and faster for less money than Edgar Ulmer. Interestingly enough, though, when the film was finally cut, they did spend some time on the soundtrack. And it is a fully realized soundtrack. There are ambient backgrounds, there's some sound effects. There's actually, I think, a pretty interesting musical score by Leo Erdodi, someone Ulmer had worked with before. I think he really did a particularly good job with Vera's introduction. There's sort of a little bit of a sympathetic theme. And then it, you know, it's contrast to that razor sharp dialogue and the ferocious delivery. And in fact, Arodi was filmed recording the two classical piano pieces from the beginning of the film, which is Chopin and Brahms. And although, you know, we see Al Roberts, you know, playing the pianos in those scenes in the Break of Dawn nightclub, it's Erdodi's hands in the close-ups. I don't know if you remember this shot, but there's beautiful close-up of his hands playing. And those, in fact, that's the composer playing. So, you know, when it came out, well, first of all, let's talk about some of these slides. Let's look at some of the images. Can you put up number 1, please? Okay, so here we see, you know, very much the opening of the movie. We see Al, you know, again, this is the present. This is him in the diner in Reno, and he's about to tell us this, you know, bizarre story. Of course, the song that haunts him, you know, I Can't Believe That You're in Love with Me, is playing on the jukebox. And we get from this very kind of normal diner scene to slide 2, which of course is, you know, what a great film noir shot, and what a pained and challenged guy, you know, we have here. And he's going to tell us this story, and he wants us to believe all of this and who he is and what he's about. And then, you know, at first he's going to introduce himself as this guy who works at the nightclub in scene 3. And, you know, and this is Sue Harvey, of course, and, you know, and Al at his best. And she actually does perform her own number, the actress Claudia Drake. It's interesting because that song, I Can't Believe That You're in Love with Me, was not the song they were originally going to use in the movie. They were going to use a song called Sophisticated Lady by Duke Ellington. And it was only at the end that they added this song. And of course, because, you know, it's playing on a jukebox, we never see anyone perform it, they were able to substitute it. But again, we're being told by our unreliable narrator about this, wonderful love affair, right? And this wonderful woman, and that somehow, he has a formal musical education and can play Chopin and Brahms. I'm not sure I believe any of this. Slide 4. So this is a wonderful sequence when they're, walking the streets of New York after the nightclub. But of course, they never were in New York City. In fact, they were anywhere. So shooting the whole scene in fog is certainly a very inexpensive way of avoiding to have any kind of set. But at the same time, the lack of money created a scene that is kind of memorable because it does feel sort of detached from reality, where we're in some kind of dreamlike world that, Al, the narrator, is imagining and telling us about, and of course, she finds out that, he finds out that Sue's not going to marry him. I mean, he really thought she was going to marry this guy, and then he's heading west. And then scene 5. Well, of course, this is one of the trademark things of these films, are these incredible montages, right? And this is, of course, we see the map, and we see passing of time and distance, and of course, throughout the film, there are very unusual wipes. Not dissolves, wipes. That we see. And of course, you see people like Tarantino use those kind of wipes these days, and also iris shots, and a very unusual shot. At the rear view mirror of the car, and we kind of actually iris into the mirror, as a transition. Slide 6. Yeah, so he's out hitchhiking, and still appears relatively normal guy, but also again very confusing. We never know. He seems to be on both sides of the road. The cars come from different directions. There's no. I don't think they actually had worked it all out. And as I said, in post they had the flip shots to make this all turn into anything. And then seen slide 7. Okay, so this is that. There's of course that famous rear view mirror they use quite a bit, and of course the scars, that appear on Haskell's hands, and what a wonderful way to set up a character. At the moment, we're not sure, what this has to do with our story, but as soon as we meet her, we certainly can figure out pretty quickly that she's that character that he was talking about, and Haskell obviously had something happen between the two of them that was pretty significant. And in fact, if you look at slide 8. Okay, so slide 8, again, one of our unreliable, wonderful narrators sequence where he's imagining her, Sue is now in LA and a huge success. And of course, probably was, working in some diner as a waitress. But we're in this. We're very much wrapped up into to Al's whole idea of what reality is. And then in scene 9. So this is the strange kind of death of Haskell. It was sort of set up. He's taking some kind of pills, right? Maybe he has a heart condition. We don't really know why he dies, or all of a sudden here we have, fate striking, a dead man. What am I going to do about that dead man? How am I going to deal with this dead man? I don't know. Or does he hit a rock when he falls out of the car and that's what kills him? It's not completely clear to me, but at the same time, I don't think it really matters. What matters, of course, is what does this do to Al, and what does he change, and how does it change him? And in fact, in slide 10, we see, we see a guy who's obviously tormented, and what is he going to do? And he, a weak man, he decides he'll, paranoid man, he takes this route of changing his clothes, taking his money. I'm not sure how rational any of this is, but this is very much, the way he reacts to this situation, and starts, of course, this incredible journey down the road. I will mention, of course, that this is a great road movie, and certainly when you think of the whole lexicon of road movies, I'm sure this inspired and was watched closely by a lot of the directors who later went on to do these kinds of two people on the road movie. And then slide 12. Yeah, so he meets Vera. He doesn't know what the hell happened. I often question exactly, why did he pick her up? Here he's a guy running from the law. Why pick up a hitchhiker? He's not interested in her sexually, obviously. What is it that makes him pick her up? Or again, is that the narrator's version of what happened? And who knows what actually put these two people together? Because if you think about it logically, that's the last thing I'd want to do is to pick up a narrator, pick up a woman if I'm trying to stay lay low and avoid. And I love the line, because he looks at her, he says, yet besides the crummiest, thrown off the freight train, yet in spite of that, I got the impression of beauty, not the beauty of a movie actress, mind you, or the beauty you dream about with your wife, but a natural beauty, a beauty that's almost homely because it's so real. I'm not really sure, if I completely believe that, but that's the story, right? And that's what he's going to tell her. And then, of course, if you look at her wacky hair, that was the makeup people putting cold cream on it. So it somehow looked glossy and wild. And what an impression. And then on 13, here we if looks could kill, here we see someone who really is making an impression, who's and of course, her famous line is, say, what do you think you're talking to, a hick? Listen, mister, I've been around. I know a wrong guy when I see him. What you do? Kiss him with a wrench? That's great Pulp Fiction dialogue, and she gets away with it. She can say that stuff, and we don't feel like it's completely absurd. And and then of course she has that famous line about sniffing perfume in Arizona, and then they get in slide 14. So now they've gotten to this apartment, and and Al has a very simple idea. I'll go sell the car, but it soon becomes very obvious he's really a dope. He doesn't know about if he has insurance for the car, or what kind of insurance for the car, and again, Vera is gonna somehow take on this whole situation and comes up with this crazy new plan about how Al's going to impersonate Haskell, and that's in slide 16. Oops, did we jump one? Can you go back to the, yeah, there we go. So now they're driving, in Los Angeles. Now, of course, these are all process shots, as well as many of the shots on the road as well. These are shots that are done on the stage, these are just, backgrounds, that plates that were shot much earlier. And then we just composited, the characters in them. So there's something very unreal about the setting, unreal about all their journey in these moments in the car, because they're never actually there. They're never in Los Angeles. So, although we might see a diner or we might see a car lot, that's about it. You're never going to really see anything else except these kinds of strange, these strange shots. So next one, please. Yeah, so this is, I guess, is after they leave the, that was after the, this is the outdoor diner scene. Remember where they sit down and they have the hop come out with their food, and she comes up with this plan that somehow, Al can impersonate Haskell, which of course is totally absurd, right? He doesn't know his mother and father's first name. He doesn't know if he has a sister. He doesn't know anything about this guy's history. And it really, obviously she's becoming a bit unhinged as well to think that this could possibly succeed, but, has gotten into this kind of obsessive, mode of, this is her chance to strike it rich. Next slide. So now we're back in the apartment and, things are really starting to unravel. And I mean, just look at the faces and their expressions. This is either this the intensity, the unrelentingness of it, absolutely amazing to me. And then, of course, this is the build up to, the phone, and she runs into the to her room with the phone. And I'm not really quite sure I even understand why the cord is around her neck, but regardless, fate, he starts to pull it. And we know what starts to happen in the next slide 18. Yeah, what a shot, huh? This is, I don't know what, out the window. I mean, obviously they're in some kind of a, cheap apartment, but again, we really start to see that things are going to get really bad, and Vera's going to call Al's bluff of calling the police, and then scene 19. This is an incredible sequence, absolutely incredible scene between these two actors, and the intensity of this scene alone is probably part of how this film became so famous. And then after the murder, slide 21 or 19, let's see the next scene. The next slide. Oh yeah, this is after, of course, he's murdered her. And if you remember, besides this extraordinary expressionistic shot in the mirror, this is where we see him look at these different objects going in and out of focus. We become, perhaps, the camera becomes the most subjective in terms of being, Al's point of view ever in the film. And, in blurred images, slide 22, again, here we see it, going in and out of focus. It almost seems amateurish, but somehow the weirdness of it, and again, the boldness of the director to try things like this is certainly, I think, one of the things that certainly impressed, filmmakers, the French filmmakers, who were really looking to kind of push the limit in terms of what cinema did and how cinema was expressed. And here was this guy working with $100,000 and 28 days with this stupid script, and really doing some extraordinary thing. Slide 23, yeah, sort of more of the same. But there's such sort of pathos of this dead girl, and here are her objects, and this sort of fixation that he doesn't run, that he's not going anywhere, that he's gonna that he just has to look at all this, and allows us to look at all this. And then finally scene 24. So of course we're back to the diner, we're back to Al telling us his unreliable story. And the voiceover at this point, I was in Bakersfield before, I'm sorry, not I was in Bakersfield before I read that Vera's body was discovered. The police were looking for Haskell in connection with his wife's murder. Isn't that a laugh? Haskell got me into this house. Haskell was getting me out of it. The police were searching for a dead man. You could almost think that things were gonna, end up with perhaps, him getting away. But thanks to the production code, and I guess we can go to full frame again, that's our last slide, we have that remarkable ending where he's hitchhiking, where, when, we don't know, and the police stop, and he gets in the car, again, without us really knowing what was going to happen and how it ends. But I do think somehow it was this very satisfying ending that matched the mystery of the whole film. So as I said, when it first came out, people were kind of shocked by the film, and instead of just appearing in what they used to call grindhouse theaters, or as a B movie, it did play some top theaters. And in 1946, it played in the 2,200 seat Orpheum Theater, if you can believe that, with a live stage show and Buddy Rich, and but this has just lasted. Roger Ebert, all of the great critics have the same idea and the same feeling for this haunting, creepy movie, an embodiment of the guilty soul of film noir. No one has seen it, and no one who has seen it has easily forgotten it. The great documentary filmmaker Errol Morris, I don't know if you guys are familiar with them, his comment about it has the unparalleled quality of despair, totally unrelieved by hope. Oddly enough, a remake was tried to be done in 1992 with Tom Neal's son, Tom Neal Jr., but obviously very unsuccessful. So much wonderful dialogue. I'm sure you have your favorite ones. You know, as I drove off, it was still raining, and the drops streaked down the windshield like tears. I mean, how do you get away with that stuff? At Haskell, I was tussling with the most dangerous animal in the world, a woman. You know, stuff like that is just kind of crazy dialogue, and it all seems to work. You know. So, you know, again, I thought it was great fun to watch again. I hope you enjoyed it. Love to hear your thoughts, questions. Please go ahead, Jeffrey.
Yeah, thank you, Fred. Great talk. We have from Michelle and Delara two separate questions to ask you to explain what is a B movie versus an A movie.
Well, it really is budget more than anything else. So again, we don't really have that distinction anymore. Now we have what we call studio movies, and then we have sort of independent films that are privately financed and lower budget. And of course, the other distinction used to be that the A movies had movie stars and B movies had unknown actors. Now that distinction doesn't work anymore either, because they're low budget independent movies that movie stars will be in, because of course the studios won't make interesting dramas or unusual movies anymore. But back in the day, in the Hollywood system in the 30s and 40s, this was very common. B pictures, many studios, even the big studios would make big pictures besides the poor poverty row studios. And they would appear as part of a program, as I was describing, or they would appear in what they called grindhouse theaters, which were theaters that specifically showed B movies. And in fact, the grindhouse movie circuit survived for quite a while. In fact, one of the first movies I ever worked on was a film called Death Sport in 1977 with David Carradine. And that, you know, was a B Roger Corman movie, but there was a movie theater in Times Square where it played for 1 year because, you know, it was exactly what the audience who wanted those kinds of B movies, you know, went to. I guess they probably paid less admission. But that term of B movies is really not relevant today, but at the time was something very, a thriving part of the industry.
Thanks, Fred. Simon Warswick is asking, do we have a date or source for when exactly the term of film noir was first used?
Yeah, I believe it was 1948 or 47, and it was one of the French critics of the time. I don't think it was Truffaut or Godard or Andre Besson. I don't know. Do you know who the first?
Guy Nino Frank.
Okay. Yeah. And was it 47, 48, somewhere around there?
You're about right, 47, 46, that period. He was writing about Houston, the Maltese Falcon, and Double Indemnity, and a couple of other. I think Murder My Sweet was another one that he was citing.
Right. So, you know, and of course in French it just means, you know, black film, right? You know, but he really, you know, they started to articulate what the characteristics were. And it's so interesting, of course, because the filmmakers didn't know it. You know, when Billy Wilder was making Double Indemnity, or Preminger didn't know, you know, when he was making Noir, they didn't know they were making a film noir. And I'm not sure they were conscious of the fact, oh yeah, let's have these narrations that start at the beginning and everything's a flashback. Was it a coincidence? Was it just, you know, in the movie? But it, you know, it's kind of interesting how it did evolve. And of course, even today, you know, we see modern day examples. There've always been film noir movies. They're no longer in black and white, but if you think of a movie like Chinatown or some of the Coen brothers early movies, you know, the concept of a film noir style is still very prevalent.
Great, thank you for the question. David Kligman asks, do you think the director intended a different ending, but the production code required an ending resulting in justice? You know, you mentioned.
It's a great question. The script did not have that ending. The script absolutely, well, that's not true. Because like I said, the notes to add the ending happened before they shot. So they knew when they went to shoot the film, they had to shoot that ending. But it was only because of the note from the production code. So I wonder what the original ending would have been. Maybe it just left him, you know, hitchhiking on the road, and you know, what would fate hold next, you know, in store for this guy was going to be a mystery. So that, so it was shot and it was planned, but it was not the director's idea or in the original screenplay either. In fact, in the original screenplay, in the original book, Al gets caught at the apartment, at the hotel, after murdering Vera, even though accidental. So very different.
We had a previous message from Jeff Duncanson, and thank you for your keen message, Jeff. It goes something like this. In your opinion, does Detour have an undercurrent of masochism? Al doesn't try to get away from Vera, although it seems like he could easily enough. Do you think the willingness to be figuratively castrated is intentional? I love that sentence.
Well, I think it is intentional. Obviously, this is a movie about a role reversal, right? And here we have Vera playing what would traditionally be thought of as the male role, the aggressive one, and the one cooking up these crazy ideas and schemes, and we have Al playing this kind of weak and whiny guy who kind of goes along with things, even it's illogical. Again, assuming that any of this is true, because this is all, Al telling us this story, after these murders have taken place. This may be, his explanation or rationalization about why and how everything happened, but it's certainly not necessarily what happened, right? Because that's the whole genius of this film to me is the narration, which is quite prevalent throughout the entire film. This isn't just a little bit of narration here and there. He really is telling us this story and constantly kind of chiming in with, oh, and then this happened, oh, and whining about these situations. So yes, I don't know if the word masochistic is correct, but I think, again, as I said, maybe there was something going on in society with these soldiers returning from the war. I don't know if it's survivor's guilt or, why did my, best friend who was standing next to me get killed? I survived. Do I deserve to have a happy life? Do I deserve to be able to just, again, no PTSD in those days. They didn't know what the mental health situation was. But I think maybe that had something to do with this. Maybe that had something to do with influencing the way people related to the movie and why it got, attention. There's no reason this movie should have gotten the attention that it did, even when it first came out. Then, of course, it disappeared and then was rediscovered. So I think that's a great question. And I think there's some truth to what he's saying.
On the same vein, we have Alva Rogers, who's also asking kind of on a counterpoint, and that is, why do you disbelieve the protagonist? And Alva has taken Al on face value in this particular movie and was actually thinking maybe he picked up Vera because it reminded him of Sue, or someone did the same favor for him previously. Just wondering if you can explain.
I don't know. I just, this is particularly watching it this time. That was the impression I got, that somehow this whole story feels like a story. I don't really, I'm looking at this guy, he's narrating this, he's obviously, agitated and kind of not a terribly stable, frame of mind when he's talking to us and on the run and lost everything. And he starts to tell us this sort of sad sack story. And then, I see him playing, like a trained classical pianist. Doesn't kind of compute, that's the same guy, and that this lovely girl wants to marry him, and all the things that happen are sort of extreme in a way when, again, so I felt, of course we feel sorry for him, and of course, again, I do believe this is, a commentary on fate and how we can look at our lives and blame, things that that was just bad luck that happened to me. And, and again, I think of him picking up Vera as a hitchhiker, this scraggly 20-foot. Why, or maybe that's not how it happened. Maybe that's not how they met. And, of course, that he never, made it, even though she was throwing herself out. I mean, they were living in this apartment. They never had sex. And I don't know, some of it just seems illogical. So that's one of the reasons you start to become suspicious.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Alva, for the question. Of course, Michael Clays is asking, there's a scene early on where Al is talking to Sue on the phone, which seems completely out of character. He's happy and optimistic. So this is when he decides to go to LA. Do you have any comments on what's going on?
Again, a great question, and another great, and we also have this strange shot of Sue sitting there, right, talking, holding the phone. But is she really there doing that? Is that just his imagination of her there doing that? In the same way, in his imagination, she's singing, and in a nightclub and doing well. This all stretches one's, reality. And so, crazy idea. Okay, I'm just gonna, I have no money, but I'm gonna hitchhike across the country. And Sue, who ran away from me, moved to LA to get away from me, is gonna be so excited when she sees me. She's gonna, I don't think this is a totally sane guy. So it's an odd scene, but I think it's sort of, again, an important scene because it tips us off that something's really strange going on here.
Yeah, great. Carl Ingram has a comment that there were not murders. The man was killed when his head hit a rock. And Al did realize she'd looped the phone cord around her neck, although he does seem to claim the murder, in his sort of paranoid state at the end of the film.
Well, again, of course, you're absolutely right. Great point. He doesn't murder anybody in this movie, according to him, right? According to his versions of these stories, he never murdered anybody. This was all just bad luck. He just, happened to get into the wrong guy's car, and the guy happened to fall out and hit his head, or was taking these pills, and Vera happened to wrap the cord around her neck, for some reason, again, so yeah, you're right. He never, and of course, we don't even know what's going to happen. So maybe he does get picked up by the police. Are they going to be accusing him of murders? I mean, we don't know what's going to happen. But what this really is about is his internal state of mind, and how these incidents, either the way they actually happened or the way he's telling us they happened, have completely impacted him and driven him a bit nuts or crazed and unstable. And now he's at this point where he's adrift in the world and has nowhere to go, and is truly in a kind of hell.
Well, the pivot moment as well is when Haskell hits his head on a rock, and even if he's dead or he's not dead, who decides to go and change clothes and not maybe pile him into the car and take him to the hospital or get to the nearest town to help the man? He's got this, forced destiny about himself in which he believes he is guilty all the time, and even speaks to the audience at one point and pulls them in as his jury and executioner. Would right. You believe this?
That's exactly right. In his voice, exactly. So he's living in this paranoid kind of world of, and believing that, there's some fate out there that's, pulling the levers and creating these situations for him. And again, I wonder, when you think, if as I told you a little bit about Edgar Ulmer's own life, he certainly was someone who was, fate, came and prevented this brilliant, genius young filmmaker from being a great success, like many of his, his comrades were. And he wound up living this very odd career and very odd life. And probably felt that, did he make a few bad choices? Yeah, I guess so. And these are consequences, and how do you live with your consequences? So, I think it all becomes very, interesting stuff for, a very kind of just thriller, sort of little B movie, which is what all that this was supposed to be.
You make a really good point, Fred, because if you think about it, as you pointed out previously in your review of Ulmer, he came over in the 1920s, prior to people like Wilder and Siad Mack and Zinnemann. And that movie you talk about, and by the way, I recommend it to individuals if you can see it, is called People on Sunday. And it's like a documentary of the sort of dwindling days of the Weimar Republic. It's a beautiful movie, and all of those guys worked on it. And so you're right. I'm sure that must have been on his mind, and all those guys did great things, like Zinnemann and
yeah. Zinnemann was like, push the camera card around. He was actually considered more brilliant. I mean, Murnau really chose him as his guy to help him with set design and visual images, and probably helped create storyboards. And so, this was, it's sort of tragic, but maybe that tragedy is part of what informed these kind of very unusual films that he made. And this is certainly the best known, but there were others as well that were actually quite wonderful. If you really want to learn more about this director, there are other films. There was a Western he did. I can't remember the name of it. Do you remember the name, Jeff? There's a Western that is absolutely extraordinary, like nothing you've ever seen before. If you can imagine the same director with his mentality doing a Western. That's something like, right, again, in the same period of time, mid 40s, late 40s.
A couple of other comments,
Sure.
more so. I love Lindy Albin's notice of he's kind of a poor man's Marlon Brando without the machismo or sex appeal. I just needed to comment on that. My grandmother.
I kind of was imagining, James Dean in that part. Because James Dean had that kind of vulnerable, woe is me.
My grandmother would have called him a Casper milquetoast, Fred. But and Barry Bender mentions, this is his comment, I was blown away by Detour, which is great, Barry. Never saw it before, so I must thank you for turning me on to it. We'll definitely watch it again after some time to settle from its dark intensity and defeatist fatalism. Weak, pathetic, self-destructive characters, however, so compelling on the screen. I totally agree with that.
That's a great comment, and I'm glad you enjoyed it, and I'm glad others who have not seen it before had a chance to see it. I mean, that's kind of what we're trying to do with this Film Noir series. We're showing some of the famous ones and classic ones, and then, of course, something like this that you may not have seen. But as you can see, why this really kind of embodies many of the characteristics of Film Noir, and again, was recognized both, and especially later by many filmmakers as being something quite unique.
Maria's recommending that movie you're talking about might have been Damaged Lives, and Jeff Duncanson is asking if it might be The Naked Dawn. So
The Naked Dawn, that's the one.
Yeah. Cool.
So if you have a chance. So anyhow, well, this is great. Thank you all for joining. Great questions. Really love getting feedback and input and everything else. Now, next Monday night, we will be skipping, and that's because Sunday night, of course, we're having our second, anniversary of the Westdale. We'll be showing The Big Sleep, one of my favorite film noirs, obviously also a very romantic movie with, Lauren Bacall and Humphrey Bogart. And the format is different. We'll be showing it and watching it all together on, on a Zoom-like presentation. And of course, we're charging money because it is the big fundraiser for the year for the Westdale, $25 per household. So join us if you can. But then the following Monday, after the week later, we're going to show, of course, one of the greatest of all time, which is The Third Man, Carol Reed's great movie, written by Graham Greene, of course, one of the great writers, great novelist of that time. And of course, starring Orson Welles, an incredible performance, and Joseph Cotton, and just a remarkable cast. So join us if you can, of course, for Valentine's Day, but if not, I hope to see you in 2 weeks, and we'll tell you in 2 weeks about the next film series coming up. So have a good week and stay safe. Thank you, Jeffrey, again, for all your help with this. Really appreciate it.
See you all on Sunday. Take care. Have a good weekend.